The smell of diesel hung in the air as John Thompson saw his world crumble before his eyes. 50 years of dedication, memories, and love turned into rubble by merciless machinery. The petals of his prized Damascus star roses, mixed with churned-up earth and debris, danced in the wind like colorful tears from a history that was being brutally erased. "This is illegal. You can't do this." His shaky voice could barely compete with the roar of the tractors. John, at 78, leaned on his cane as he watched the workers of Stevens and Associates Construction continue their destructive task in what was once Thompson Gardens, one of the hidden gems of Millbrook, Connecticut. Margaret Stevens, president of the local HOA and owner of the construction company, watched the demolition from inside her shiny black Mercedes-Benz. Her satisfied smile was visible through the partially open tinted glass. For her, the historic garden was nothing more than an obstacle in her plans to revitalize the Oak Hills neighborhood. "Mr. Thompson," she said, finally getting out of the car, her Christian Louboutin heels clicking against the asphalt, "the notices were sent out 3 months ago. The council voted unanimously to build a new parking lot. Progress is inevitable." "What notices?" "I've never received anything," protested John, his calloused hands from decades of gardening shaking with anger and despair. "These roses, some of them were brought from France by my grandmother Charlotte during the war. They are part of the history of this city." Rachel Martinez, a young lawyer passing by on her way to her office, stopped when she saw the commotion. She knew Thompson Gardens well. It was one of the places where she used to find peace during her morning runs. Seeing the machines destroying that green sanctuary made her blood boil. "Excuse me," she interjected, approaching John and Margaret. "I'm a lawyer. Mr. Thompson, do you have documentation of ownership of this land?" Before John could answer, Margaret interrupted. "This is association property. It's been in the HOA record since 1975. "Actually," John said, his voice finding renewed strength, "I have all the original documents at home. This land was a gift from the city to my family in 1946 in recognition of my father's work as a botanist during the war." Rachel frowned, her legal gears already at work. "Mrs. Stevens, I suggest you stop the demolition immediately. If Mr. Thompson has valid documentation, this could turn into a very unpleasant lawsuit." The next few hours were a whirlwind. Rachel helped John gather his documents, while Andrew Parker, a reporter from the Millbrook Herald who had been alerted by residents, began documenting the destruction. Local social networks exploded with images of the destroyed garden, and the story of the elderly gardener who had his heritage razed began to gain traction. Nancy Wilson, a botanist from the University of Connecticut who had studied the garden's rare species, showed up at the site with a team of researchers. "Some of these varieties are unique, Mr. Thompson. They are botanical treasures that cannot be replaced." The tension increased when other residents began to gather. Robert Henderson, an 82-year-old man who had lived in the neighborhood as long as John, brought old photographs showing the garden in its early days. "I remember when Charlotte Thompson planted these roses. It was 1946, just after she came back from France. She cried when she saw the first flowers open, saying that they were a symbol of hope after so much horror in the war." Margaret Stevens was beginning to realize that her rash decision could have greater consequences than she had imagined. The buzz on social media, the presence of the press, and a possible legal battle were not in her plans. But her pride prevented her from backing down. "We have all the necessary permits," she insisted, although her voice no longer carried the same certainty. "This is a project approved by the city council to modernize the neighborhood." Rachel, who had just finished a call with her office, approached again. "Mrs. Stevens, I just checked the city's online records. There is no authorization for demolition at this address. What's more, this land has been listed as a heritage site since 1980. The sun was beginning to set on Millbrook, casting long shadows over the wreckage of what had been one of New England's most extraordinary gardens. John Thompson sat on a surviving bench, his hands caressing a single Damascus star rose he had managed to salvage from the rubble. Nancy Wilson approached him with a small, hopeful smile. "Mr. Thompson, we managed to save some bulbs and seedlings. With proper care, we can try to preserve part of your grandmother's legacy." Andrew Parker, the reporter, continued to document everything, his photos capturing the contrast between the destruction and the dignity of the elderly gardener. The story was far from over, and the battle for Thompson's garden was just beginning. Rachel Martinez was already planning her legal strategy, while the community rallied around a cause that represented much more than just a garden. It was a fight for the preservation of history, beauty, and justice in a small town that was about to discover its voice. The news of the Thompson Garden's destruction spread through Millbrook like fire through dry straw. The next morning, a crowd gathered in front of the devastated property. Among them was Claire Bennett, the great-granddaughter of one of the town's founders, holding a sign that read, "Save our history, save Thompson's Garden." Rachel Martinez had spent the entire evening poring over old documents at the Pearson and Associates law office. The original property records that John Thompson had provided revealed a fascinating and legally significant story. Not only did the land legitimately belong to the Thompson family, it had also been declared a municipal historic site in 1980, with additional protections established in 1995. "I found something interesting," Rachel explained to John, as they sipped coffee in Mr. Wilson's small diner next to the destroyed garden. Ms. Stevens forged documents to get approval from the HOA board. The signatures of the city council members were forged. John held his cup tightly, his wrinkled hands shaking slightly. Charlotte always said that these roses were more than flowers. They were symbols of resistance. She brought them hidden in her suitcase when she fled occupied France. Nancy Wilson, a botanist at the University of Connecticut, had set up a small emergency laboratory in her home to try to save what was left of the rare species. "The Damascus star is not just a pretty rose," she explained during an interview with the Millbrook Herald. "It's a variety that we thought was extinct in Europe after the Second World War." Mr. Thompson's garden was home to the last known specimens. Margaret Stevens, for her part, was facing a growing storm. Her political connections were beginning to drift apart, and even her closest allies on the HOA board were questioning her actions. During an emergency meeting of the association, Richard Hawthorne, vice president of the HOA, confronted her publicly. "You assured us that you had all the necessary permits," he argued, his voice laden with disappointment. "Now we find out that the documents were forged? That's more than negligence, Margaret. It's a crime." The situation gained even more momentum when Michelle Thompson, John's granddaughter and a history professor at Yale University, arrived in town. She brought with her a team of historians specializing in cultural preservation. "This garden is not just a piece of land with pretty flowers," Michelle explained during an impromptu press conference. "It's a living testimony to the resistance during the Second World War. Every rose here tells a story of courage and hope." Rachel Martinez obtained an emergency injunction preventing any further construction on the site. Judge Patricia Blackwell, known for her strictness in historic preservation cases, did not hesitate in her decision. "The destruction already caused is a crime against our cultural heritage," she declared. "Any further attempt to alter the site will result in severe criminal consequences." The community is mobilized in unexpected ways. The Millbrook Garden Club, led by Mrs. Dorothy Fisher, organized the task force to catalog and try to preserve any surviving plants. Students from the local school started a fundraising campaign to restore the garden. "My grandmother would be proud," John said, watching the volunteers at work. "She always believed that a garden brings people together." The investigation into Margaret Stevens' actions deepened when Andrew Parker, the Herald reporter, discovered a similar pattern of behavior in other projects by the developer. In 3 neighboring towns, historic properties had been demolished under suspicious circumstances, always with questionable documentation. "This isn't just about a garden anymore," Rachel explained during a meeting with John and other residents. "It's about stopping a systematic scheme to destroy historical heritage in favor of real estate profit." The pressure increased when the Connecticut Historical Society became involved in the case. Dr. Harold Freeman, president of the institution, personally visited the rubble of the garden. "What happened here is a tragedy that transcends Millbrook. These roses were part of an irreplaceable botanical and historical collection." Meanwhile, in Nancy Wilson's makeshift greenhouses, a small victory emerged. 3 Damascus star seedlings had survived and were beginning to show signs of recovery. It's as if they have the same spirit of survival as Charlotte Thompson, Nancy commented, showing the sprouts to John. The legal battle had only just begun, but the Millbrook community had found common cause. The Thompson Garden was no longer just an old man's dream. It had become a symbol of resistance against corporate greed and disrespect for history. At the end of that week, as the sun set over the rubble of what had once been one of New England's most beautiful gardens, John Thompson watched a small rose sprout among the debris. It was a silent reminder that, just as his grandmother Charlotte had proved decades before, some things are too strong to be destroyed. An unexpected discovery shook Millbrook the next morning. While cataloging the damage in the garden, Michelle Thompson found an old metal box buried near the roots of one of the oldest roses. Inside, a worn diary of Charlotte Thompson revealed much more than war memories. It contained information that could completely change the course of the legal battle. "Dad, you need to see this," Michelle called out to John, her hands shaking as she flipped through the yellowed pages. Charlotte didn't just bring the roses from France. She took part in a secret resistance network that used gardens to hide Jewish documents and refugees. The very mayor of Millbrook at the time, Gregory Harrison, was involved in establishing this garden as a secret memorial. Rachel Martinez immediately recognized the legal value of this discovery. This further strengthens the garden's heritage status. It's not just a botanical garden, it's a historical monument to the Second World War. The news spread quickly, attracting national media attention. The New York Times sent a team to cover the story, and CNN was preparing a special report on the Garden of Resistance, as it was being called on social media. Margaret Stevens, feeling control slipping through her fingers, tried one last desperate gamble. Through her lawyer, she offered substantial financial compensation to John Thompson, $1 million to end the case and allow the construction of the parking lot. "Some things are priceless," John replied firmly during a tense meeting in Rachel's office. "This garden carries the history of people who risked their lives for freedom. It's not for sale." Nancy Wilson and her team of botanists made another surprising discovery. Among the surviving Damascus star roses, they found a unique variation that had distinct genetic characteristics. "This particular rose may have unexplored medicinal properties," she explained during a presentation at the University of Connecticut. "We found compounds similar to those used in cancer treatments." Connecticut's Jewish community mobilized after the diary's revelations. Rabbi David Goldstein of Temple Beth Israel in Hartford organized a memorial service at the site of the garden. "This sacred space represents the light of humanity in dark times," he declared, his voice laced with emotion. Meanwhile, Andrew Parker continued his investigations into Marbert Stevens. His articles in the Millbrook Herald revealed a disturbing pattern of corruption involving other members of the city council. "The construction of the parking lot was just the tip of the iceberg," he explained to Rachel. "I found evidence of bribes and irregular deals in at least 5 other projects." The pressure on Margaret increased when Richard Hawthorne, the HOA's vice president, decided to collaborate with the investigations. "I can no longer be complicit in this systematic destruction of our history," he declared in an emergency board meeting. Claire Bennett, the great-granddaughter of the town's founder, organized a photographic exhibition at the Millbrook Historical Museum, featuring images of the garden through the decades. The photographs showed visits from famous botanists, community celebrations, and, most significantly, secret meetings of war veterans who knew its true history. "Every rose in this garden tells a story of courage," Michelle explained to visitors to the exhibition. "When Charlotte planted a new rose, she was also planting a memory of those who risked everything for freedom." The legal battle gained a new ally when the Connecticut State Historic Preservation Office filed its own lawsuit against Margaret Stevens and the HOA. State Attorney Jennifer Richardson personally took on the case. "The willful destruction of a historic site of this importance cannot go unpunished," she said at a press conference. John Thompson, despite his sadness at the destruction, found renewed strength in the discoveries about his family's legacy. Every morning, he visited the greenhouses where Nancy Wilson tended the surviving roses. "It's as if Charlotte is guiding us," he commented, watching the new shoots emerge. "Even after so much destruction, life finds a way." Rachel Martinez, working tirelessly on the case, discovered another crucial element. Margaret Stevens' bank records revealed suspicious transfers coinciding with the dates of the forged documents. She didn't act alone, Rachel explained to John and Michelle. There's a whole corruption scheme involving public officials. The Millbrook community was transformed. What began as a battle over a garden had become a movement for historic preservation and justice. Amateur gardeners from all over the region offered seedlings and seeds for eventual restoration. Historians and archaeologists requested permission to study the site in search of more historical artifacts. Charlotte always said that a garden is a testament of faith in the future, John reflected, sitting on his favorite bench among the rubble. She planted roses in the belief that future generations would understand her message of hope and resilience. As the sun set over Millbrook, casting golden shadows over what remained of Thompson's garden, a new determination grew in the small town. The battle was far from over, but each new revelation strengthened the certainty that some stories are too strong to be buried, just like the roots of Charlotte's roses, which continued to sprout among the rubble, silent witnesses to a story of courage that refused to be forgotten. The Connecticut District Attorney's Office was buzzing with activity that Thursday morning. The investigation into Margaret Stevens' activities had expanded far beyond the destruction of Thompson's garden, revealing a complex web of corruption that stretched across the state. We found a systematic pattern of destruction of historic properties in 5 different counties, explained District Attorney Marcus Reynolds, as he presented the evidence to Rachel Martinez and Jennifer Richardson. Ms. Stevens wasn't just building parking lots. She was deliberately erasing historic landmarks to manipulate property values. Rachel, who had spent the last few weeks immersing herself in old documents, noticed a disturbing connection. All the sites destroyed had some connection to the Second World War or the French Resistance. It can't be a coincidence. The investigation took on a new dimension when Michelle Thompson, working with historians from Yale University, discovered correspondence between Charlotte Thompson and other members of the French Resistance who had immigrated to New England. The gardens weren't just memorials. They were part of a wider network of historic preservation. Each garden was like a living page from a history book, Michelle explained during a presentation at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., which was now showing interest in the case. The roses were coded. Each variety represented a family save, an escape route, a story of survival. Meanwhile, in Millbrook, the community continued to mobilize. Dorothy Fisher from the Garden Club had turned her own backyard into a temporary nursery for the seedlings rescued from the Thompson garden. It's as if each plant we save is a small victory against oblivion, she commented, gently tending to the surviving shoots. John Thompson received daily visits from war veterans and their descendants, each bringing their own stories of connection with the garden. Robert Henderson, his old friend, arrived one morning with a box of old photographs. "Look at this, John," said Robert, showing a yellowed photo from 1947. "Here's her grandmother Charlotte with my father. He never told me, but apparently she helped my family escape from Lyon in 1943. The roses weren't just flowers. They were marks of gratitude." The pressure on Margaret Stevens increased when Richard Hawthorne handed over compromising emails to the prosecution. The messages revealed an elaborate plan to turn historic properties into commercial ventures, using forged documents and bribes to circumvent preservation laws. Nancy Wilson made a surprising announcement during a botany conference in Boston. "The variation of Damascus star that we found in the Thompson garden is not just rare, it's unique. Genetic analysis has confirmed that this rose has characteristics that make it extremely resistant to disease. Its DNA could be crucial for the development of more resilient crops." The international media began to pay attention. A French documentary filmmaker arrived in Millbrook to produce a film about the connection between New England gardens and the French Resistance. "C'est extraordinaire," he commented, filming the rubble of the garden. "These roses are silent witnesses to history." Rachel Martinez was preparing for the grand jury when she received an unexpected call. A former employee of Margaret Stevens wanted to testify. She wasn't just destroying gardens, the witness revealed. She was systematically erasing physical evidence of a time that some people would rather forget. The legal battle took a decisive turn when the Connecticut Supreme Court agreed to hear the case on a priority basis. Judge Patricia Blackwell, known for her defense of historical heritage, would preside over the trial. John Thompson, observing the constant movement of people around what was left of his garden, reflected on his grandmother's legacy. Charlotte always said that roses were messengers of time, he commented to Michelle. They carry stories that need to be remembered. The U.S. Department of Justice announced that it was opening a federal investigation into the activities of the HOA and Margaret Stevens Construction Company. The charges now included fraud, conspiracy, and violation of historic preservation laws. This is bigger than Millbrook, Rachel explained during a meeting with John and other residents. It's about preserving not just a garden, but the living memory of one of the most crucial periods in modern history. Nancy Wilson and her team have achieved a significant breakthrough. 3 of the rescued Damascus star roses have started to bloom in the temporary greenhouse. It's as if they're telling us that no matter what happens, life and memory find a way to persist, she said, showing the delicate pink flowers to John. The Millbrook community had been transformed. What began as a battle over a garden had become a movement for the right to memory, history, and justice. As the sun set over the rubble of the garden, now surrounded by FBI isolation tape, John Thompson held up one of the surviving roses. "You know, Michelle," he said to his granddaughter, "your great-grandmother used to say that every rose planted was a promise for the future. I think I finally understand what she meant." The Hartford County Courthouse was packed on the morning of the trial. The Thompson versus Stevens case had become a national symbol of the fight for historic preservation. John Thompson, wearing his best navy blue suit, the same one he had worn to Michelle's wedding, sat erect next to Rachel Martinez, his hands resting on a wooden box containing Charlotte's diary. Margaret Stevens entered the room with her corporate lawyers, her posture still arrogant, but her eyes betraying an unusual nervousness. The evidence accumulated over the last few weeks was devastating. The FBI had uncovered offshore accounts linked to a larger scheme of systematic destruction of historic properties throughout the northeastern United States. "Your Honor," Rachel began her opening argument, "this case is not just about a destroyed garden. It's about a deliberate conspiracy to erase crucial chapters of our history. The Thompson Garden wasn't just a collection of rare flowers. It was a living memorial to a time when ordinary people became extraordinary heroes." Prosecutor Jennifer Richardson presented the evidence methodically. The emails revealed by Richard Hawthorne, the forged documents, the suspicious bank transfers. More impactful, however, was the testimony of Holocaust survivors and their descendants who traveled from different parts of the world to talk about the historical significance of the resistance gardens. "My father survived thanks to people like Charlotte Thompson," said Sarah Birdman, an 85-year-old from Israel. "Every rose in that garden represented a family saved. Destroying it wasn't just a crime against property. It was an attempt to erase our collective memory." Nancy Wilson presented scientific evidence about the botanical importance of Damascus star roses. "These flowers are not only historically significant," she explained, showing slides of her research. "Their genes carry unique characteristics that could be crucial for the future of sustainable agriculture." During the lunch break, John found a quiet moment in the courtroom corridor. Michelle joined him, carrying one of the surviving roses in a small vase. "Grandpa, look," she smiled. "This flower opened this morning. It's as if Charlotte is telling us a tear." Margaret Stevens' defense collapsed when her lead lawyer, confronted with evidence of participation in the scheme, decided to cooperate with the prosecution in exchange for a plea bargain. He revealed an elaborate plan to turn historic sites into commercial enterprises, using a network of front companies and corrupt public officials. "The parking lot was never the real goal," he confessed. "It was part of a larger plan to completely redesign the neighborhood, eliminating any trace of its original history." The Millbrook community packed the courthouse. Dorothy Fisher and the Garden Club had distributed small Damascus star sprouts in tiny pots to each person present. It was a silent demonstration of resistance and hope. When it was his turn to testify, John Thompson walked slowly to the witness stand. With a firm voice, he began to tell not only his story, but the saga of 3 generations of his family. My grandmother Charlotte taught me that a garden is more than soil and flowers, he said, his voice echoing in the silent room. It's a living book of stories. Every rose she planted carried a memory of courage, of sacrifice, of hope. When Mrs. Stevens ordered the destruction of the garden, she wasn't just removing plants. She was trying to erase a testament of humanity. Judge Patricia Blackwell, known for her severity, was visibly moved. After 3 days of testimony and arguments, she handed down her sentence. Margaret Stevens was convicted of fraud, conspiracy and destruction of historic property. The HOA was to be dissolved and reorganized under new management. More significantly, the court ordered the complete restoration of Thompson's garden, with funds coming from the confiscation of Stevens' assets. The site would be officially designated a National Historic Landmark, ensuring its permanent protection. This court recognizes that some losses are irreparable, said Judge Blackwell. However, we can ensure that the legacy of Charlotte Thompson and the resistance lives on for future generations. In the months that followed, the transformation was remarkable. Under the guidance of Nancy Wilson and an international team of botanists, the garden began to be reborn. The surviving Damascus star roses were successfully cultivated, and seedlings were distributed to historic gardens throughout Europe. Michelle Thompson established an educational program on the site, welcoming students and researchers interested in learning about the connection between gardening and resistance during the war. Charlotte's diary was digitized and her stories began to be translated into several languages. On a quiet fall afternoon, a year after the process began, John Thompson sat on his restored bench in the reborn garden. Charlotte's roses were blooming again, more vibrant than ever. Rachel Martinez, who had become a close family friend, joined him. "You know, Rachel," he said, watching a group of schoolchildren learning about resistance roses, "Charlotte always said that some things are too strong to be destroyed." She was right. The garden survived. History has survived. And now, more people than ever know its message. A new bronze plaque shone at the entrance to the garden. Thompson Memorial Garden, a testament of courage and hope. Below it, in smaller letters, was a quote from Charlotte's diary. "With every rose planted, we also plant the seed of memory. And as long as there are those who remember, hope will never die."